From across time and space and throughout the multiverse, listen as multiple generations of geeks come together to discuss the iconic characters, events, and franchises that make up the very fabric of pop culture as we know it. Let Your Geek Side Show presents Then and Now. Hey guys, this is Kitty.
And this is Autumn.
And we are coming to you from the Sideshow Studios in Southern California. This week, we're taking a trip down to Derry, Maine to join the Losers Club and investigate the mysterious disappearance of childhood innocence. With 27 years between Pennywise's attacks and a coincidental 27 years between adaptations, It has become one of the new titans of modern horror. As Hollywood continues to look to Stephen King's novels for inspiration, let's take a look at the story that can take on as many faces as we have fears. This is Stephen King's It, Then and Now. All right, so thank you for joining me again this time, Autumn.
Of course.
This one is kind of a little bit different than previously when we talked about The Wizard of Oz, another film that's got kind of not an anniversary necessarily. It's kind of a scary anniversary when you think of it. So coincidentally, so we're talking about Stephen King's It. You all heard the intro. There have been 27 years between the 90s miniseries and this latest adaptation, which coincides with the attacks of Pennywise in the town of Derry.
Significant number of years within the story.
Yes, so I look forward to the third remake in another 27 years. Yes. So to be honest, when they announced the remake for 2017, I mixed up this story with, because I'm not a big horror person. I've been slightly dabbling in it more and more lately because there's been some good stuff. But I mixed this up with a novel I read as a child, which was called Five Children and It. But that is a certified children's novel by Edith Nesbit.
Very different.
Very different. And it's about five little nice, proper, posh children who meet this kind of creature. They find him in a rock quarry, so not quite like a sewer, but he grants wishes, and it's
this is a very different story.
Yeah, so I was like, this is weird.
Did you go to the movie thinking you were going to see that?
No.
Okay,
no. I had enough time to figure it out, but there is a novel called Five Children and It, and it is not the same story for those of you out there. For the one
half
person,
our listenership just dropped off.
for the one person in the world who has listened.
Yes.
To It. No, so this is It. This is Stephen King's It. Very strange to talk about because the title is It.
And it's interesting because in this case, the then and now, there is an absolute then version and an absolute now version. Whereas when we did Wizard of Oz, there was just a then and now perspective of the same film.
Yes. And the novel had preceded the films, and as in this case, but by so much more than the anniversary.
So it's two different generations' interpretations of the story.
Yes.
One then and one now, which is interesting.
Yeah. And so I think it's interesting to note. So for your reference, audience listening, at the time we are recording this, It Chapter 2, the 2019 film, has not released publicly. I have seen it at an advanced screening, but the world premiere has already occurred. So we're in this weird period between review and then this podcast is going to go up.
Right.
So I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything, but there are some things that hopefully in the discussion, if you know how the novel goes, you will know how the film goes. But there are certain elements that I want to maybe discuss whether or not they were able to carry it into the film.
Right.
So, do you want to start with the 90s miniseries? Because I have not seen that.
Right. Well, I did. That came out in 1990. And I had already read the book because I am a Stephen King fan and started reading Stephen King in high school. And this came out when the miniseries came out when I was a senior in high school. So that definitely tells you my generation is the then generation, not the now. And I had read the book already. And I was a big fan of the book. I'm a big fan of, obviously, of Stephen King in general.
That's quite a hefty book, too.
It is a huge, hefty book. And I am not a horror fan in books or in movies, but I eat up everything Stephen King writes and always have. For some reason, that's always been the exception, is I'll read Stephen King.
Okay, fair enough.
So I was already a big fan and had a huge anticipation for the miniseries. And so then, of course, I was let down and disappointed at the time because it did fall short of the book because it's 1990s television special effects and the story is, there's a lot to it that needs to get watered down for television. So at the time I was a little disappointed, but over time it really did grow on me. I thought that the adult actors did fine. It was okay. I don't think it was the best acting I'd ever seen. Some of it was very much like I am acting now, and this is what I'm going to show you. But the children that were cast were amazing and embodied the characters so well that I did watch the 2017 film and actually had a hard time accepting those children as the characters because the 1990s children did such an amazing job.
Well, it's also interesting between the two adaptations, and I think it was a very necessary update for 2017. The 2017 film takes place in the 80s. And then when you hit the 2019 film, it's more or less early aughts, kind of, or like it's almost, they don't even pin it to a specific time period, but it is the general now.
Yeah. Whereas the 1990s, the children were children in the 50s, and then adults in 1990 or 1980, late 80s. But I think that's a completely different story because growing up as a preteen in the mid 1950s is a very different experience and tells a different story. And I noticed a huge difference in some of those elements because of the time change. That even though I think it was better filmmaking, the 2017, I thought we lost some things that were really unfortunate when you get rid of the 50s. And specifically, in the 50s, the kids' nightmares and terrors came from all the horror movies from the 50s, like The Wolfman and The Mummy and vampires and all that. Those were the monsters. Whereas when you go into the 80s, you lose that because that wasn't the experience growing up in the 80s.
Yeah, because even in the 2017 film, you can see on the marquees of the movie theater, like Terminator and Batman, or that's the kind of time period that you're going into, and so these kids are used to big action flicks, and there's been some creepy films by that point as well.
And the horror was much more visceral and in your face and bloody and gory, whereas in the 50s the horror was psychological and anticipatory, not gruesome, and that changes to me the story.
Yeah, and I think that difference is most perfectly embodied in the visual of Pennywise.
Absolutely.
Because yes, it's common knowledge in this day and age, everyone's like, clowns are creepy, and we have news stories where it's like random people dressed as clowns show up and terrorize a town. Like, that's a thing that happened. And so the clown is generally understood to be a very frightening figure. There are very few instances now of this is a lovable figure, let's all go to the circus or something.
Right.
But Tim Curry's Pennywise seems to have that ambiguity that he is something nice until he's not.
Yes, he was psychologically terrifying. I found him to be absolutely scary. And he never actually did anything. Like the Sarsgaard 2017 Pennywise was scary in that he was violent and imminent all the time. He was just about to kill people all the time. Whereas Pennywise very rarely was actually killing people. He was, but not anywhere near as often. He was most of the time just creeping people out, scaring them. He was basically fattening them up, if you will, because his goal was to make them as afraid of him as possible. Because belief in him was necessary, and that fear of him was necessary in order for him to conquer them.
Yeah, and so having seen both the 2017 and 2019, there came a point in the second film where I was like, okay, the Pennywise scares are predictable by this point. And I did rewatch the first film before I went and saw the second one just to get an idea. But the Pennywise scares are very formulaic because you see him show up and you're like, it's not is he going to get them? It's a matter of what point in the scene, where should I be looking, what prop is going to burst off the wall and be the object of violence in this scene. So it does take a very different approach. In the first film, I felt it was really effective. Second one was, it's like you can't keep using the childhood method of scaring people to the adult characters. But as you noted, like they were afraid of monsters and stuff in the 50s. And in this one, we do get some of the similar from the novel and from the original televised series, but they invented some new kind of visuals. Like there was the headless child who like came down the library steps to terrorize Ben. That was a new one for the film. And so they came up with alternate visuals because some of those characters wouldn't be as effective, I don't think.
It fits more with the new horror genre as opposed to the 50s, 60s horror genre.
Yeah, and then that also gives one of the touchstone characters for me in the franchise there is Richie. He's personally my favorite child. But the fact that he's like I wouldn't believe the Finn Wolfhard trash mouth child transplanted in the 50s. I know there's a different type of way, but the way that he's making sexual jokes about Eddie's mother constantly and that was very different. And I'm like, okay, this is more in line with 80s stuff because the reason I talked myself into going to see the first one in the first place was because Finn's also in Stranger Things, which has that very nostalgic,
very similar vibe.
Yeah, 80s nostalgia that puts us in the space of, okay, this is a time for action movies and iconic characters that are in our pop culture now. And so it was, I was like, oh, poor Mike Wheeler's just having a really bad summer with the clown and the Demogorgon. But so that was the fact that it was transplanted into the 80s was so wholly different. And I think had the new one had it stuck with the earlier time period, it wouldn't have been as effective.
Well, it's interesting because the 50s, the earlier version was Seth Green as a child, and he was much more of a jokester, and it was a more innocent Richie, which I think the entire crew was a more innocent crew, which I think is interesting because this book is about innocence. And they lost some of the innocence when they took it from the 50s and put it in the 80s, and that innocence was a character trait of the story. So I found it interesting, even though I think that the filmmaking was better in the 2017, I thought the story was more true to the heart of the story of it in the original 1990s miniseries. Like, for instance, in the 1990s miniseries, Silver was a very important part of the story because they had these monsters, these universal monsters. And in those movies and in those comic books, the way you defeated a lot of those monsters was with Silver. So the children believed in the power of Silver. So the Silver came out they decided that by shooting Silver at the monster, that would be how they defeat it. And because they believed that, it became true. Because they had this innate belief that was not questionable. That yes, if there's a werewolf or there's a monster, you kill it with Silver. Therefore, it works.
Yeah.
And then also, Bill had the bike, Silver, and he had absolute belief in the power of this bike. He said, "Hi-ho, Silver." He would ride. They would escape the beast. As an adult, he was able to rescue his wife from her catatonic state by riding around with her on Silver and touching back into that childhood belief in the power of Silver, and that is how he saved his wife. And in the 2017 version, they got rid of all of that because it wouldn't have worked in the 80s because children didn't have that universal monster. And I mean that in a different sense. Yeah. Universal, meaning like this monster that they believe exists and this is how you defeat it. That didn't exist in the 80s. There's many different monsters.
Yeah. And I think also one of the key, because you do see the children and you go, okay, yes, this is a child and by definition they are innocent. But then of course we've got Richie making his jokes and the way they speak to each other. But one of the key points I think that they emphasized, and I know it is present in the novel, and I'm not sure how present it is in the miniseries, but one of the first things you come to realize in the newer film is that the children have all already kind of lost a sense of innocence because of the way that their parents treat them. And the emphasis on the parents also being part of the monstrousness in their lives is really present in the 80s. And I think that for a more modern film audience, I think that is more palatable. I know some of the scenes we see are terrifying in themselves, but we've got Eddie's overbearing mother who has made her son believe he's deathly ill, and so he only really feels well when he's with his friends. And of course, we've got Beverly's father, which is they've drastically played up the unfortunately sexual nature of that,
the incestuous nature of that, as opposed to a different type of oppressive, controlling behavior that was in the miniseries. It's become more twisted.
Well, and then the one of the only instances we get with Bill's parents is the outburst of you just have to accept that your brother's dead. And that's the only scene I remember them from the first film, and I think that's the only one they're in is when they yell at their child. And Mike has no family, and then of course we've got Rabbi Uris who is pushing his son to become a man, and so we really get to see the way that they've all kind of lost a sense of innocence, and we see a sense of maturity in those children already because you're realizing this is what they're forced to deal with already.
Well, it's interesting because you know that you get the sense that those parents also grew up in Derry, and those parents lost their innocence when they were children because there was a rash of children disappearing and being murdered when they were children. So this whole entire town has lost their innocence and been warped, and I think that comes through in the 2017 film.
Yeah, I actually, as I was reviewing and rewatching the film and preparing for this podcast, I noted that Pennywise is a lot more insidious. That was the word. then like on a first watch, you're like, yeah, I know the evil clown is there and like it's kind of creepy, but there's a lot of, they took a great amount of care to do a lot of references to Pennywise being there if the clown wasn't necessarily on screen. Two of the bigger examples I noted were, I mean, obviously we have the balloons and when the older couple drives by in the car and they just kind of look.
They look away.
Yeah, they look away. But when Ben Hanscom is in the library, when he flips open the book to read about the ironworks explosion, and they do this brilliantly, and now I'm like, oh God, I never want to not look at the librarian is standing in the back with her arms at her sides, smiling at Ben as soon as he opens the book, because she's all nice. She's like, oh, you should be out with your friends. And as soon as he opens that book, you know that Pennywise is imminent, but she's standing in the back just smiling at him. And then the other big one was throughout the film, if you see a television set and it is on, it is playing that show that Pennywise ends up on. But it's on the television in Henry Bowers' home.
Bev's house.
Bev's house when she sneaks in.
Yeah.
Richie's mother is watching it.
Yes.
Or not Richie, Eddie's mother. And so you start to realize, like, because you don't really think of that show until you see the kill them all. But you realize that is on the television.
Pennywise has been fattening up this whole town for generations. Yeah. It's a part of their life.
And that makes it part of the terror when you're like, why won't the parents acknowledge that there's something wrong with something is killing the children? You have the Betty Ripsom's mother who waits for her daughter outside the school, but otherwise a lot of the parents turned a blind eye.
I think that's the trade-off in this movie that they receive in exchange for the loss of the magical silver element, because this, what we just described, didn't exist in the miniseries and was more alluded to in the book. It wasn't as prevalent as they chose to make it in the 2017 film. So I think that's interesting. I don't think you can necessarily I think it's an interesting trade-off.
It definitely speaks to the values of the culture at the time.
I think so,
even though it was made in the 2017 this time period, but just even the values of the 80s.
Yeah. It was kind of more like Stand By Me, The Body, which also takes place in Derry. The parents are just, for the most part, they're just kind of there. They're not characters. They're not necessarily important. You kind of hear about them, but they're not as important a part of the story. And so that's what's happening more in the book, and in the 1990s miniseries, is that they're there. You see some of them. They definitely have some impact, but they're not as ingrained as they are in the film.
Now, I know we don't want to necessarily cover it, but there is, in all this talk of loss of innocence, there's a very important thing that was omitted from both versions of the adaptation, which I think ultimately in our modern storytelling sensibility, it's better that got kept out.
Leaving it out
for people who've read the book, there is a very interesting way in which the children all decide controversial, that's a word for it, decide to lose their innocence and make the pact. The modern film ends with them all cutting their palms, which anytime anyone does that in a movie, I'm like, come on, that's gotta hurt.
In the book, all these themes are about childhood and adulthood, bridging the gap between them, choosing one over the other, abandoning one. There are these two elements that you are balancing, and I want to say that maybe his intent was to join those elements, but it's still, I don't see how you could ever put in an adaptation without it being horrifying.
Yes. So for those of you who've read the novel, you know what we're talking about. For those of you who do not,
you're better off not.
Yeah, you can look it up online. But it's very interesting that they chose to leave that out of. Not interesting. It makes sense, but there are so many other ways to allude to it. And we do get.
And I think the blood oath does bridge that gap between childhood and adulthood, because it is this statement that they are making that's a very adult, bond that they have formed and made this pledge.
Yeah, and we even do have characters. And of course, it comes back, the idea of cutting your hands comes back in a sad way when Stan Uris takes a bath.
Yes.
But we do have several characters who also go through their struggle is already the becoming an adult. We've got Beverly, and then, of course, her terror is the blood in her bathroom.
Right.
And Stan is going through his bar mitzvah process. And so there's multiple ways that they've been able to exercise that in the films.
What was interesting is that, we talked about that Tim Curry's Pennywise, that his weapon was terrorizing them so that they would be afraid, because it was necessary for them to believe in him in order to defeat them. And when you turn that the other way, when the children figured that out, they realized all they needed to do was to believe, to not be afraid of him, and to believe things, and they became weapons. Eddie in this miniseries and in the book had an asthma inhaler that he comes to find out is placebo. There's nothing in it. And that it's worked because he believed it worked. And they all realize that. And so when they are fighting Pennywise the clown, he says, this is battery acid. He believes it to be true. The children believe it to be true because they know that's the power. And he sprays him with it, and it starts to eat away at his face, even because they believed it. And that's a huge theme in the miniseries, is the belief is what gives them power. And the fear of him is what gave him power when they took that away from him and instead gave themselves power. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I don't want to give away the ending of the second film, but it's interesting because it, as we've said, they don't really rely on that mystical belief, but it is more of the way that they do it, and you can see even the themes of it in the first half of the film saga, it's the expression of the truth. Because
like owning their own.
Owning the truth, owning and having the peace of mind and presence of mind to say what is true. So I think in the best example of it in the first film is Bill's inability to admit that his brother is dead. And so in that same way, his belief that his brother is still out there a year later is what lets Pennywise creep into his life. And so it's that fervent belief. And so at the end, when he has to say, "You're not my Georgie," and he shoots him in the head, it's that admission of the truth. And so they do that in an interesting way. It was a little strange, but they pulled it off convincingly.
So less
in the
about
second
belief
film.
and more about acknowledgement.
Yeah, and so one of the big things is also like this isn't real. Remember, this isn't real. Like not saying. So it's almost the opposite, because where theirs is we have to believe that something is real.
Yeah.
This is we have to remind ourselves that it is not real. So it's very different
it's a different
sides.
twist.
Yeah, I think especially
and it speaks
because
to those generations for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just very interesting the way they chose to do that. And the newer film makes some interesting choices that deviate from the source material. Not too heavily, but I was really interested. They also brought back, because I know in the novel there is kind of the second phase of this Derry terror opens with the hate crime attack against a young man, a young gay man who ends up in the canal kind of there. And they brought that back in the film, and I think it was handled well in terms of it wasn't made a joke, and there were adaptations made that made it more realistic. But there's more representation than that in the second film. I'll say that without God, I wish I could just tell everyone everything, but it's a very good film. I think it is definitely worth it. The second part, it's interesting to compare the runtime of the miniseries, because we were thinking, oh well, obviously you'd have to leave stuff out.
More time to explore than the movies do,
but they don't.
Turns out, no.
The second film is 2 hours and almost 45 minutes long, and the first film is over 2 hours, because that's how modern storytelling is. So that's
the miniseries was like 3 hours and 15 minutes or something like that.
Almost 5 hours of film, and you'd think they have more time to explore things, but there are quite a few things from that I will say. Hopefully, no good. After the initial introduction of each of the spouses and stuff, you don't see them again for the rest of the film. So that was one of the things that was interesting, because it allowed more time to focus on the friendship of the Losers Club, but it also left out a huge part of their growing up, which was their
relationships outside this club. How did they relate to people?
Yeah, because especially I think it's humorous, and you do get a little bit of it, but Eddie's married a woman who's just like his mother, and unfortunately Beverly's in an abusive relationship, but Bill is now successful and he's got his wife that and they also made some professions updates for a modern age, because in the book Richie is like a radio producer, he's like a radio personality, but that wouldn't play in the mythical 2017 that this film takes place in. So they've made some updates to their careers. So it is very interesting, but this film really does put the focus more on both the individuals of themselves, but then their collective Losers Club, but not much outside of that.
You know, what's interesting, in the miniseries, they had Eddie's whole thing was that his asthma inhaler was a placebo. He didn't actually need it. When they made him an adult, he was still living with his mother. he didn't actually need to live with his mother. He just believed that he did at the time because he's a 40-year-old man. Of course he doesn't leave. And he ran his own business with a partner, and yet he lived with his mother who controlled and protected him.
Interesting.
So he still had the placebo effect that he needed these crutches.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting just to watch the evolution of these characters. It's strange
There's a lot
to see
to
how
explore, for sure.
Yeah, there's so many characters, so many different facets of life and living. But I think through both versions, they've done a fantastic job of exploring what they could. I mean, it is
no matter what
the book is like 4 pounds.
The novel is
alone.
massive.
Yeah, so obviously you can't cover everything, but
Yeah.
I think these adaptations do a great job. And who knows, maybe in 27 years they'll cover even. Oh my God, what would it be? What would they like? Oh, early 2000s kids with like Pennywise on social media. Like
Yes.
we'll check back.
That would be the flashback.
Yeah,
would
we'll check
be the social media.
God.
They'll go remember when social media was a thing, and they'll all laugh.
Oh my goodness,
It'll be so nostalgic.
So nostalgic, and the little red balloon emoji keeps popping up in my phone. But it is interesting that there's enough. I'm of the belief that like good Shakespeare can be performed in any context.
Absolutely.
This almost seems like a story that so long as kids have that fear and that the transition into adulthood,
Right. And the adults have the nostalgia and longing for the childhood.
There is the potential to explore this film.
Interesting.
Before we sign off here, what do you think Pennywise would show up as to you if you were a child?
A list of errands. Errands I have to run. Oh, as an adult.
Oh,
that would be my
Okay.
As a child, a clown would probably be all it would take.
Okay. For me, it'd probably be like a wasp or like a hornet
that
or
would do
something. But it is interesting just to think of like that potential for fear. You'd like to think you've grown out of it.
I like to have my answer ready as an adult.
List of chores.
Errands. I don't want any more errands.
All right. Well, I think that's about all we have to say on this. So we're going to head back to the Losers Club and get on with it. But thank you guys so much for listening because this was it then and now.
Get it?
As It Chapter 2 brings this latest resurgence of Pennywise's power to a close, a new generation of horror fans has faced fear in all of its forms, from dancing clowns to deadlights. Will this monster lay dormant for another 27 years? Is there more to explore in the sewers of Derry, Maine? As long as children fear the monster under the bed, Pennywise will lurk in our imaginations. But despite the loss of innocence, the strength to overcome our fears comes from friendship. We survive and overcome the trials of youth. Growing up doesn't have to mean losing everything that makes us who we are, so long as you've got a good group of losers to back you up. Thank you for joining us. This has been Stephen King's It, Then and Now. Do you enjoy listening to Then and Now? We are proud to bring you pop culture content completely ad-free, but that doesn't mean we don't need your support to help keep us going. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting platform and help spread the word about our podcast. We welcome fan feedback. Email us at podcasts@sideshow.com with your thoughts and suggestions for how we can make our shows even better. Plus, tune in for our full network of pop culture podcasts. See if your fan favorites make the cut in the Geek Culture Countdown, a bi-weekly podcast featuring pop culture top 10 lists. Hear exclusive interviews with celebrities and pop culture industry leaders as they let their Geek Side show in Look Who Showed Up. Join comedian Jeff May and his special guests as they discuss anything and everything in Sideshow's Sideshow. Then get all the latest pop culture news with our daily briefing, a 2-minute breakdown of the biggest geek headlines perfect for your Alexa or Google News briefings. We wouldn't exist without your continued support. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to let your geek side show.